Alright, my darlings. Well, we've been through quite a lot these last few months, haven't we? I did a review of one of my most requested franchises, I brought back Hartnell, and I finally reached 1,000 subscribers, thanks to you lovely people. But it's time to take things a bit back down to earth for this video, which is ironic because the franchise I'm talking about is anything but down to earth, but it is very familiar to this channel. Doctor Who. I've made it no secret of my love of this campy, silly, but incredibly well written and entertaining sci-fi show, and while I've done tons of videos about it on my channel in the past, I've not really looked at the Doctor him/herself before, which is something I think I should do. So I decided to bite the bullet and just straight up make a video of the Doctors, ranking them from worst to best. Now those who follow my DeviantArt would know that I have broken down the Doctor's characters in a basic sense before, so this can be considered a more detailed look at it. So with 14 Doctors to get to in this video, that's a lot to cover, so let's get straight into it. Now before we go on, there are a few things I need to establish here. Firstly, as always, this is just my opinion. This is not an objective, factual list about how good each individual Doctor is. If you disagree with the list, great, you're entitled to your own opinion. This is just how I see it. Also, this is a judgment on the characters of the Doctors, not a judgment on the show itself, although how each individual Doctor's series turns out is going to affect my rankings a little bit. And finally, there are a few people who have played the Doctor in the past but are not official Doctors. So before we go on, let's take a look at a few honourable mentions. Peter Cushing, one of the greatest actors of all time, did play the Doctor in 2 movies that were made to try and bring the Doctor to a more overseas market, which would not be the last time that they would attempt this. The movies are alright, but Cushing's performance is what makes them worth it, even if he's just doing a more subdued version of the first Doctor. Richard E. Grant. He's the first person to play the Doctor in animated form, and while the animated film he appeared in is pretty forgettable, he is quite entertaining, playing a sort of mix between Jon Pertwee and Sylvester McCoy, and is also the only Doctor to be potentially gay.
You've reached the good ship TARDIS. We're rather busy at the moment. Leave a message after the beep and we'll try and get back to you before you call. Stop that!
We really should change that message.
Rowan Atkinson. Yes, Mr. Bean and Blackadder himself did in fact play the Doctor once, though it was only for a spoof done for Red Nose Day, which was actually Stephen Moffat's first outing in Doctor Who. His performance is basically just the same performance he would do later in Johnny English, but it works, though I personally found Joanna Lumley's performance in that short to be more memorable.
My best friend by my side, my trusty old TARDIS, and of course, my sonic screwdriver. Oh, look, it's got 3 settings.
Mark Gatiss. Yes, believe it or not, League of Gentlemen member and Doctor Who writer Mark Gatiss himself once played the Doctor, but only for a quick spoof video made for BBC Two's Doctor Who Night in 1999. But I felt it worth mentioning since it's quite a funny moment in Doctor Who history. So with that out of the way, let's get to the list proper. And to be honest, the guy I have at the bottom of this list is going to piss a lot of people off, but it's my list, so this is how we're doing it. At number 14, we have Peter Davison. Yes, I know this is a controversial choice, especially considering who his son-in-law is, has made him a bit more relevant in recent Doctor Who history, but I have my reasons for having him at the bottom, I swear to you. He's considered to be one of the most down-to-earth and gentlest of the Doctors, dressing and acting like a courtly gentleman you would find at the terrace of a 1960s dinner party, and this was chiefly exemplified through his love of cricket. But this does lead to his greatest downfall as a character. He's boring as hell. Davison's portrayal of the Doctor is best described as a runaway character from Downton Abbey who found a time machine and started going on adventures. Although to be honest, I think that would actually be more interesting if that really did happen.
Have you any means of identification?
No, I've never needed any.
Fortunate man. Just exactly who are you and what are you doing here?
I'm afraid if I told you, you wouldn't believe me.
Now to be fair, Davison had an uphill battle anyway, since he was filling the shoes of a man who had played the role of the Doctor for close to a decade and made Doctor Who the cultural milestone it is today. I mean, yes, Hartnell, Troughton and Pertwee did make Doctor Who a household name, but Tom Baker made it a worldwide name. So I give Davison credit for doing his best, and he is very accessible as a Doctor, especially compared to who followed him, but the scripts he was given gave him very little to work with.
Definitely civilization.
which does make sense since this was the point where Doctor Who was going through a bit of an awkward transitional phase, where they weren't sure where they wanted to go in terms of tone, style and story content. But Davison's run does have some highlights like Earthshock, The Caves of Androzani, and his run also gave us the last purely historical adventure with Black Orchid. Though, then again, with one of his companions from another universe in the future having a doppelganger in 1920s Britain is still pretty bizarre anyway.
3, sir, is what comes after 2.
Do you know, that's exactly what I thought.
And then 4, and then 5, and then 6, and then 7.
Stop, please! You're making me dizzy.
I certainly don't hate Davison, and there are many people who would consider him their favourite, and I can certainly see why. He's very kind, gentlemanly, and accessible as a character, so if that's the kind of Doctor you're looking for, he's the one to go for. But personally, I prefer the more outlandish Doctors, which is why he's at the bottom of my list. But it's time to move on to bigger and better things in terms of the Doctor. Though sadly our next entry doesn't really represent that. At number 13, we have Paul McGann. This entry is kind of a process of elimination decision, since while I do like Paul McGann as the Doctor, he only appeared in one movie and one short of the TV series, so he kinda has to go near the bottom, but that doesn't mean he should be forgotten at all. As I've mentioned in the past, during the 90s, the people behind Doctor Who were trying all sorts of things to revive the series for a new audience, and one of the biggest of which was the Doctor Who movie in 1996, which wasn't exactly successful in recapturing audiences, and sadly since it's owned by Fox, I can't really show you any footage of it. But the movie is quite enjoyable in its own right, and one of the parts that makes it so good is its version of the Doctor. McGann was a bit of a departure from the previous Doctors, being a lot younger than most actors who started playing the role before, as he was most well known for his off-the-wall performances like in Withnail and I. But his version of the Doctor is also one of the more accessible, despite having a bit of an identity crisis due to not knowing exactly who he is for the first half of the movie, and how he also might be part human, but that's not important right now. And also, ever since somebody pointed out that he looks like Tarzan from the Disney version of Tarzan, I can't not picture him as being that character from now on. He can best be described as a more friendly version of Sherlock, being very intelligent and often going above and beyond to save the world, but has a more of a giddy and fun-loving disposition to him, which is ironic given the horrific circumstances in which he regenerated. Sadly, like I said, we only got to see him play the Doctor on screen twice, and while they were both good, we never got to see him on screen again. But that doesn't mean we didn't get to hear him again. Some of you may be familiar with Big Finish production audio dramas about Doctor Who, but for those who aren't, they're kind of like old school radio dramas like you would hear in the 1930s or on Radio 4, but to be made to release on CD or to stream online. And Doctor Who is surprisingly one of the biggest franchises in the audio drama world, having done hundreds of them, and Paul McGann has done more audio dramas than any other actor who has played the Doctor before or since. So it's good to know that, even though his time as the Doctor was short-lived, he still keeps it close to his heart. But now let's move on to an actor whose time as the Doctor was anything but short-lived. At number 12, we have David Tennant. Another decision that's going to get me ripped limb from limb in the comments. Though I will admit that while David Tennant did a fantastic job in bringing back Doctor Who to the public attention, and did an equally great job in launching his insanely successful career after he was the Doctor, of all modern versions of the Doctor, I have to be honest, he's the one I find the least interesting. Now I should point out that, much like Davison, this is more down to the writing of his run than his acting, as his performance is the best part of this version of the Doctor. He gives such a spellbinding and moving performance and really shows off all the different layers that this strange man has had over the years. In fact, arguably his performance is the best of all the modern Doctors, but his key critical flaw of his character is in how he's written, and this comes down to the man who has caused arguably more splits in the Doctor Who fan base than Stephen Moffat and Chris Chibnall combined. Russell T Davies. I'm not going to dwell on Davies too much because this is about the characters and not the writing, but the key essence of Davies's writing is that he's fantastic at writing characters, but not very good at writing stories. The 10th Doctor is very much a charmer, the kind of person who believes in himself and has a bit of a love for himself, and this self-love becomes very contagious to the people he meets.
Oh, I'll think of something.
You're just making this up as you go along.
Yep. But I do it brilliantly.
He's also got a bit of the self-confidence, arrogance in him that reminds me a bit of Rick from Rick and Morty, which is fitting because David Tennant was the primary inspiration for Rick's character. The downside of this character is that Davis clearly loves him as much as the Doctor loves himself, because the way he holds the Doctor aloft and makes all the other characters worship him throughout the series gets really tedious. Hell, just the fact that he, at one point, makes the Doctor as close to Jesus as you can possibly make him in this series, twice, it really shows he was making the 10th Doctor a bit of a Gary Stew, unfortunately. It also doesn't help that Tennant is playing one of the more judgmental and pious Doctors of the series, which he does his best to pull off, but it's rather irritating after a while.
I should have told them to run. As fast as they can, run and hide, because the monsters are coming. The human race.
It's one of the reasons why I love the episode Human Nature so much, because it gives us a look into a more simpler and humbler version of the Doctor. That and a look into what David Tennant's career probably would have been like if he never joined Doctor Who. Since if he never joined the cast, it was very likely that he was just going to show up in stuff like Poldark and Downton Abbey after that. To be fair, with all the Doctor's faults in his writing, Tennant really helps sells it. He's so charismatic and charming that you really do believe he's some kind of extraterrestrial messiah, and that's the reason why people love him so much, I feel. But on repeated viewings, you can really see how much this makes the show really hokey and kind of preachy. And granted, the way the Doctor is presented in the series and how he always saves the day with almost little effort does have a bit of a godlike feel to it, but part of the reason he's so enjoyable to watch is in how humble he often is, and how, despite his alien nature, he still feels human. So this way of writing him really ruins the simple charm and takes the subtext of the series and shoves it in your face. That isn't to say there isn't anything of worth in Tennant's run at all. No, most of his series is really enjoyable, and his success ensured the series' continued run. I just wish that they held off with the Jesus metaphors in this series, which thankfully our next entry is as far away from this Doctor as you could possibly get. At number 11, we have Patrick Troughton. The second actor to play the Doctor, and sadly also one of the more forgettable ones, but like any actor that played the Doctor, he has his own traits that he brought to the table that defined him and his run.
Lovely, lovely, lovely.
Troughton's Doctor was much more of a stark contrast from the man he followed, playing the role, as many people put it, as a time-travelling tramp, meaning that he came off as a bit more directionless, confused, and just let things play out and figured his way out of it with his guile.
Ah, Doctor, at last!
Why not make some coffee to keep them all happy while I think of something? Anyway, as you know, the TARDIS has a mind of its own. You know you can't control it. Can't control it? No. We'll see about that.
Troughton's Doctor is the one I've seen the least of, hence why he's so low on this list. But his final story, War Games, is one of my favourite Doctor Who serials, despite it being agonisingly long, much like this video. He's also the Doctor who introduced many classic antagonists to the franchise, such as the Ice Warriors and the Great Intelligence. He was also the first Doctor to be involved with UNIT, which his successor would come to know very closely. Troughton also went on to have one of the best post-Who careers of any of the Doctors, playing Father Brandon in The Omen, yes, the one who dies that hilarious impalement death, and made frequent appearances in the Ray Harryhausen and Hammer House of Horror movies, which is good to see, because finding work after leaving the TARDIS is one of the biggest challenges for any Doctor. Troughton's a good Doctor to watch if you're looking for a more grounded and agreeable Doctor. In fact, he reminds me a lot of my great uncle.
Oh, he's too old. But he's too fat, isn't he? No, he's too thin. Oh, no, that won't do at all. That's ridiculous.
But if you're looking for a more action-packed Doctor, maybe this one's a bit more your speed. At number 10, we have John Hurt. John Hurt is the only official actor to play the Doctor, even less than Paul McGann has, since while McGann got to expand his role with the audio dramas, John Hurt died shortly after playing the role, quite sadly. However, unlike McGann, the writers knew that this would be his only outing as the Doctor, so they really gave him much more to work with. For those who aren't familiar with him, John Hurt's role was as the Ward Doctor in the 50th anniversary special, Day of the Doctor, meaning that he's the Doctor during the infamous Time War that took place between the classic and modern series. So his character is meant to be full of sorrow, regret, and somewhat be detached from his emotions in order to fight in a war. But through that, you can still see the kind, thoughtful, and courageous Doctor fighting through all the fraught emotions and defensive mechanisms of his personality.
Why is there never a big red button? Don't sit on that.
Why not?
Because it's not a chair. It's the most dangerous weapon in the universe.
This makes John Hurt one of the more complex Doctors, which is probably why they got Hazel here to play him in the first place, given how many great roles he's had in the past, and many of which are very similar to the War Doctor. And it's impressive how much we see of him and how much characterization we got out of him in only an hour and a half, though there are some novels and audio dramas that expand on his role if you want to know more about him.
We failed doing the right thing, as opposed to succeeding in doing the wrong.
It's also great to see him interact with future versions of himself, not just part of his character development, but because at this point in the modern series, we hadn't yet seen a multiple Doctor story in the show, with the exception of Timequake, but that's a whole different can of worms.
Hey, I'm the Doctor. I can save the universe using a kettle and some string. And look at me, I'm wearing a vegetable.
John Hurt can be a bit of a hard Doctor to get into, not just because of how short his role is, but because he also came out of nowhere and was a bit of a surprise for the viewers. But if you give him a chance, you may grow to love him. Though, funnily enough, he's not as hard to love as the next Doctor on this list. At number 9, we have William Hartnell. The first actor ever to play the man from Gallifrey, though that's not the thing he's most known for in his portrayal of the Doctor. Hartnell was the first actor ever to play the Doctor, all the way back in 1963, and his performance is one that, at the time, was such a departure from sci-fi and drama shows that it's part of the reason why Doctor Who endured so much in its early years.
Don't you think you're being rather high-handed, young man? You thought you saw a young girl into the yard, you imagine you heard her voice. You believe she might be in there? It's not very substantial, is it?
However, more modern audiences may be a bit turned off by it now. Many people came into the franchise these days through David Tennant, as did I, and while he had his rougher moments here and there, he was, as I said before, so charming and accessible in his performance. So when you go from this guy...
Well, among other things, I think I just invented the banana daiquiri a couple of centuries earlier.
And then go back and watch this guy...
There's still a police box. Why hasn't it changed? Dear, dear. How very disturbing.
It makes you think, are these two really the same person? Hartnell is infamous in portraying the Doctor as a curmudgeon-y, grumpy, impatient, almost misanthropic old man archetype, but just so happens to be able to bend the laws of reality to his will. And I can't deny, when I watched the first Doctor Who serial back when I was 17, it turned me off a bit to him as well. Though to be fair, the tedium of some of the early episodes doesn't help there either. But over time, you do start to like the guy in a love-to-hate-him kind of way. In fact, it's ironic that even though David Tennant was the inspiration for Rick, out of all versions of the Doctor, he's the one who matches Rick the most in terms of personality and performance. So basically imagine Rick not drinking, 30 years older and talking like an old British fart, and you've got Hartnell. But like I said, his performance was such a great departure from what you saw on TV at that time. From the very bureaucratic and formal characters of Star Trek to the very human or surreal characters from The Twilight Zone, Hartnell's more outwardly unpleasant disposition and the fact that he doesn't want all the excitement that encompasses his life to happen, and the fact that he does what he wants when he wants and doesn't give a shit about what other people think. It was really quite a risk back then. Although that's probably because that as a person, he really was like that. I've met many people who met the guy personally, and even know one person who used to live in the same building as him, and they've all said he was a bit of a dick, which is part of the reason why they introduced the concept of regeneration in the first place. He's also the Doctor to be portrayed by the most amount of different actors, since of course being that he died quite early on in the franchise's lifespan, they had to pull in other actors to fill his role, such as Richard Herndl, who played him in the classic episode The Five Doctors, and of course Argus Filch himself, David Bradley, in what I consider to be his all-time best performance. Though it's probably a shame that we'll never get to see Rhys Shearsmith play the second Doctor again.
I told them, you know, there's only one man in England who can take over.
Oh, couldn't they get him?
At number 8, we have Jodie Whittaker. Those of you who watched my vlogs from last year will already kind of know my opinion about Whittaker's performance as the Doctor, and boy were you quick to disagree about those. But if you want a more detailed opinion than in this video, go and watch those ones again. But I do still need to get the basics down here. Ignoring her gender, since if we make her performance critique all about that, it will be a very short segment, and I wouldn't be able to move in the comments section for people getting into flame wars, it's difficult to judge Whittaker since she's only had one series so far. So there's still a lot of growing she has to do in taking on the role, and sadly it doesn't help that her head writer is also getting used to the position, so they both are a bit wobbly so far. But as a whole, I quite like her. I feel that her bubbly, slightly confused and very upbeat performance really works for me.
I'm just a traveller. Sometimes I see things need fixing. I do what I can. It's been a long time since I bought women's clothes.
And despite having some slightly dull stories in her first run, and being written a bit too much like the 10th Doctor, and I also saw bits of the 11th Doctor in there as well, her performance is something that managed to rise above all the difficult elements in the show. The key of any good Doctor is being able to believe that they're the same person as the previous Doctors that you've already seen. From the moment that you hear them speak, you can instantly tell they're the Doctor, and I feel that Whittaker achieved that with gusto from the first few minutes of the episode she appeared in.
Should buy us a few seconds. Oh yeah, long story. Tell you later.
Really, the only reason that she's a bit lower on this list is that we've still got a lot to see from her and her writer. So perhaps in the future her spot will go higher or lower on this list, but for now she dwells here. Though I really think they missed an opportunity with having the first female Doctor be Ginger. Because hey, 2 fences broken for the price of 1. At number 7 we have Tom Baker. Arguably the most iconic Doctor of all time, Tom Baker still holds the record of the longest tenure of any actor to play the Doctor. 6 years. No other actor has even come close to that record. So what does his performance actually bring to this show's legacy? Tom Baker's Doctor primarily comes across like an old-time explorer who doesn't really know where he's going or what he's doing, but he does it with such grace and confidence that it really makes him a joy to watch and be around.
Would you like a chili, baby?
You profane the sacred stone! Oh, come off it, Hieronymus. You know who I am. You can drop all that bosh about sacred stones and profanity. Just be your natural, horrid self.
But a lot of that is just a facade to cover up how skilled and serious he really can be.
Why did you come here?
To stop the development of the Daleks.
Why?
Because having lived in what you would call the future, I have seen the carnage and destruction they have caused.
You will tell me?
No.
You will tell me?
No, I will not!
But I can't deny I do prefer his more cuddly and clueless side to his persona. That and his crazy eyes, which seems to be a trait of actors who have played the Doctor with the last name Baker, as we'll see later on. Tom's run as the Doctor definitely broke lots of new ground for the franchise, not the least of which being that it let the Doctor go back to being an intergalactic wanderer, since during Pertwee's run he was banished to Earth by the Time Lords, and they had to keep the adventures more grounded. But when Tom was introduced, the sky was once again the limit, and the writers just let their imaginations completely run wild with story ideas. And a lot of this Doctor's adventures reminded me a lot of something you would read in an Arthur C. Clarke novel, and this style would define the classic series for the rest of its run. Though, to be honest, during the later years of Davison, and especially during the Colin Baker years, it did get rather convoluted and overambitious in terms of its stories. But part of what makes Tom so iconic is his signature look, that fedora, the long trench coat and waistcoat combination, and of course, that distinctive scarf. Though it does make me wonder how difficult it must have been to film in that outfit. I'm sweating my balls off just sitting here with one light in front of me and a t-shirt and shorts. He had to wear an outfit as if he was going to be climbing up Everest in the middle of summer with hundreds of lights on him. Blah. He was also the first Doctor to have a series-wide story arc with the Key to Time series, and while Troughton and Pertwee did experiment with the idea, Tom Baker was the first Doctor who fully realised it. So you have him to thank for all of Russell T Davies's really hokey and preachy story arcs. Part of what makes him so enjoyable to watch is that, much like any great Doctor, he feels so accessible to watch, but he also balances it brilliantly with the random moments of eccentricness that the Doctor usually has, and the random moments of anger, and the sense that despite how off the wall he is, you feel that you can trust him. If you were going to start Doctor Who at any point, he and David Tennant would be the best ones to start with. Although while I do regard the next entry as being more entertaining, he's by no means a Doctor you want to start with.